I was down on one knee in her bathroom, working a seized bolt loose on the bottom hinge of the shower door, and the glass in front of my face still had steam on it from an hour before. The room smelled like two things at the same time. Fired clay, coming from the little kiln she kept in the back of the house, and coffee, coming from the kitchen, where the pot had just finished running. I had a wrench in my right hand and my left palm flat against the glass to keep the panel from swinging on me. That bolt had not moved in years. Hard water does that. I remember thinking I should have brought the smaller socket in from the van. Then, I heard footsteps on the tile. The bathroom door was open. It had been open the whole time, because that is how you work in somebody else's house. You leave the doors open. You keep your boots on the mat. You don't touch one single thing you weren't asked to touch. But the footsteps kept coming. I turned my head, and Kate was standing right there in the doorway with one hand on the frame, looking at me the way you'd look at a delivery driver who showed up early. And she said, "Don't mind me." 4 words. Calm, easy, like it was the most ordinary sentence in the English language. I almost dropped the wrench right there on the tile. Not because of what she said, because of how she said it. I turned back to the hinge, and I could not move that bolt another half turn. My name is Ryan Prescott. I was 30 years old that spring, and I fixed pipes for a living in Savannah, Georgia. That's the whole resume. Prescott Plumbing. 1 van, 1 set of tools, 1 guy. I pulled my own permits, wrote my own invoices, and answered my own phone, usually with a flashlight in my teeth and my arm halfway inside a wall. On a decent week, I worked 6 days. On a good week, somebody's water heater quit on a Sunday morning, and I worked 7. I got divorced 2 years before any of this happened. Her name was Jess Harmon. We were married a little under 2 years, and somewhere in the back half of it she started using a word she had never used before. Ambition. As in, I didn't have any. I never argued with her about it. That's probably part of why she left. I told her once, standing in our kitchen at 11 at night, that I liked a quiet life. Small jobs, regular hours when I could get them. A truck that started. She looked at me like I'd confessed to something. She chose Brad Kessler. Commercial real estate, an Audi with the dealer plate frame still on it, happy hour 4 nights a week at a place downtown where the drinks came with rosemary in them. I chose to say nothing. I signed what her lawyer sent. I kept the tools in the van, and I let her keep the house because fighting over it would have cost more than the house was worth to me by then. 20 months before that first knock, I bought a townhouse in Ardsley Park. 2 stories, brick front, a backyard about the size of a good rug, live oaks over the whole street, the kind with the moss hanging down that tourists take pictures of and locals stop seeing by the age of 10. I lived there alone, no kids, no dog. A television I turned on maybe twice a month, mostly for a ball game I'd fall asleep during. I want to be honest here, because I've had a year to think about it. I wasn't unhappy. I was just very, very quiet. There's a difference between the two, and most people can't tell them apart from the outside. I'm not sure I could tell them apart from the inside either. 14 months before that morning in the bathroom, somebody moved into the townhouse attached to mine. I saw her at 6:30 in the morning, carrying cardboard boxes up the front steps by herself. No movers, no help. Just one woman and a rented cargo van and about 40 boxes, and she was doing them 2 at a time, which is a thing you only do when you're stubborn or in a hurry or both. I came out with my coffee and asked if she wanted a hand. She stopped on the steps, looked at me for about 2 seconds longer than a stranger normally would, and said, "Sure, but then I owe you a cup of coffee." Her name was Kate Sullivan. We got the whole van emptied in about an hour and a half, and that was the first time I saw the blue mug. She dug it out of a box marked kitchen, rinsed it in a sink that hadn't been used yet, and poured me coffee from a thermos she'd brought with her. The mug was ceramic, glazed a deep blue that went almost gray where the light hit it. It sat a little crooked on the counter. The glaze was uneven, thicker on one side, like it had run before it set. I said something dumb about it, like, "This is a good mug." She said she'd made it. She'd taken pottery in college, kept a wheel and a small kiln ever since, and that particular mug was from her second year, back when she still couldn't get a wall even. She said she'd kept it because it was the first one that came out of the kiln in one piece. It didn't sit level, but it fit my hand exactly right, the way a tool does when somebody has already worn it in for you, and I noticed that, and I didn't think for 1 second about why I'd noticed it. Kate did interior design. Freelance, working out of the front room of her place. Through the wall I'd hear music in the mornings, low, nothing I could name. Sometimes, she'd open the windows on the side of the house and the smell of acrylic paint would come drifting over onto my porch, and I'd know she was working on boards. We were neighbors, and that's what we were. She'd wave when I pulled the van in. I'd bring her trash can up from the curb on Tuesdays if I got home before she did. Once, she left a bag of peaches on my steps because somebody in Statesboro had given her more than she could eat. Then, about a month after she moved in, her kitchen faucet started leaking. She knocked on my door at 7 in the evening on a Thursday. I remember because I had a plate of leftovers in my hand. She said, "You're a plumber, right? I saw the logo on your van." I said yes. I went and got my tools and walked next door. It was the cartridge, which is the most common thing in the world on a single-handle faucet, and I had a replacement in the van because I always had a replacement in the van. 20 minutes, start to finish, including the part where I dried out under her sink with a shop towel. And when I stood up and washed my hands, the blue mug was already on the counter, full, still steaming. 1 sugar, which is how I take it. I didn't think anything of it. I'd told her. Maybe, that first morning with the boxes. Probably. I don't remember telling her, but I must have. Because how else would she know? Neighbors help each other. That's all it was. That's what I told myself for the next 13 months, and I want you to understand that I believed it completely. Not because I was stupid. Because a man who's already been told he isn't enough for somebody doesn't go looking for evidence that somebody else thinks he is. The second time she knocked, it was about a noise. This was November. 11 months before the morning with the shower door. She caught me on my porch after work and said there was a sound in the pipes upstairs, a knocking, mostly at night, and she wanted to know if it was something she should worry about. I went over with a flashlight. I ran every tap in the house, upstairs and down. I filled the tub and let it drain. I turned the washing machine on and stood in the hall with my hand flat against the drywall, waiting for water hammer, which is what a knock in the pipes usually is. Nothing knocked. Not one single time. I told her it might be a loose strap on a joist, and since I was already up there, I went into the crawl space above the hall closet and tightened 2 straps that didn't really need tightening. It took 9 minutes. When I came down, the blue mug was on the counter. Full. 1 sugar. She said, "You have good ears." I said the pipes were fine. I told her old houses talk, and this one was built in 1926, and a house that age is going to settle and tick and pop, and there's nothing to be done about most of it except get used to the sound. She said, "Well, now I know." And then she asked me to stay and finish the coffee, because it was cold out and she'd made a whole pot, and I sat at her counter for 20 minutes with my flashlight still clipped to my belt. She asked me what the worst call I'd ever taken was. I told her about a burst supply line off Abercorn on Christmas Eve, water coming through 3 ceilings. Then she asked whether people ever thanked me properly for that kind of thing. I said sometimes. She said, "That's not the same as yes." 3 weeks later it was the water heater. She said the shower was going lukewarm on her about 8 minutes in. I checked the tank, checked the anode, checked the thermostat, and the thermostat was set to 120, which is where every thermostat in America is set from the factory. I bumped it to 125 and told her that was as high as I'd go, because past that you start scalding people. That one took 11 minutes. We talked for an hour and 10. I remember it because I wasn't a man who talked for an hour and 10 with anybody. She asked about the van, and then about the business, and then about whether I ever thought about hiring somebody. And I told her the truth, which was that I'd thought about it and decided I liked knowing every job in the book had my hands on it. She said that made sense. She didn't say it the way people say it when they mean the opposite. Here's the part where I have to tell on myself. Kate's dining room table had drafting paper on it. Rolled sets, weighted down at the corners with river rocks. Her laptop sat at one end, and the screen almost always had a floor plan open on it, drawn in that pale blue line work you get out of a CAD program, and I knew enough to know it wasn't a hobby, because hobbyists don't dimension things to the eighth of an inch. On her refrigerator, under a magnet shaped like a peach, were 3 business cards. An electrician named Dale, a tile setter out on Wilmington Island, and a general contractor with a Savannah address and a logo that looked like somebody had paid real money for it. I saw those cards every single time I stood in that kitchen. I have no idea how many times I looked at them, and not once, not one time, did my brain put together the sentence that a woman with a general contractor on her fridge does not need her neighbor to come look at a noise the pipes aren't making. The audience always sees it before the man in the story does. 7 months before the shower door, she called about a slow drain in the guest bath. I brought the snake in, ran it down about 6 feet. What came back on the end of it was maybe a thumbnail of hair and soap, the kind of thing that would have cleared itself in a month. The drain hadn't been slow. It had been slightly less than instant. I stood up, and she was leaning in the doorway, and she said, "Thank God you were around." And that was the first time, the very first time that something ticked over in the back of my head. Because the mug was already poured. Not poured after I finished, poured before I got there. I'd been in that house 9 minutes and the coffee was still hot, but it wasn't scalding, which meant she'd made it before she called me, which meant she knew I was coming before she knew whether I could come. I noticed it, and I filed it under nothing, and I went home. 5 months before, the shower handle came loose for real. The set screw was stripped out of the valve stem, which is a genuine repair, and I didn't have the part, so I drove to the supply house on Bull Street and came back with it. 45 minutes on my knees in her bathroom, which, if you're keeping track, is the same bathroom I was in on the morning she said, "Don't mind me." When I finished, she'd cooked dinner. She hadn't asked. She'd just started cooking somewhere around -20, and by the time I washed up there were 2 plates on the table, and it would have been strange to leave. That was the first meal. She asked how I got into the trade. I told her about my grandfather, who had a shop off Waters Avenue, and who put a torch in my hand when I was 12 years old, and taught me to sweat a copper joint before he taught me to drive. I told her he used to say a good joint is invisible. Nobody praises a pipe that doesn't leak. That's the whole job. Kate put her fork down and looked at me and said, "So you like working with your hands? Not because you ran out of other options." And I said something like, "No, I guess not." I'd been married for 2 years to a woman who never once phrased it that way. Jess had used the word settle. Not cruelly. She'd say it the way you'd say a diagnosis. "You've settled, Ryan." And after enough repetitions, a word like that stops being an opinion somebody has about you and starts being a fact you carry around in your chest. Kate had just taken the same set of facts about my life and read them in the opposite direction, and she'd done it in one sentence, over a plate of chicken, without appearing to think about it at all. I sat there and I did not know what to do with that, so I asked her about the pottery instead, and she told me she'd learned to throw on a wheel with a bad bearing that wobbled, and every mug she made for 2 years came out crooked because of it. She said her hands had learned the wrong lesson so well that she'd had to unlearn it on purpose. I said that happens in the trade too. Guys who learn a shortcut wrong at 19 and spend the next 30 years doing it wrong fast. Later, clearing plates, Kate said something I did not understand at the time. She said, "Sometimes the reason somebody knocks isn't the reason they give." I asked what she meant. She said, "Nothing. It's a designer thing. Clients hire you for a kitchen, and what they actually want is to stop feeling like a stranger in their own house. I said, huh, and I carried the plates to the sink, and the line went into the back of my head and sat there for 5 months, doing absolutely nothing. 3 months before, she called about water pressure. Said it felt low. I put a gauge on the hose bib. 60 pounds, which is not low. Which is, in fact, exactly what you want. I told her that. She said, okay, good, and poured the coffee, and I stayed for 40 minutes with nothing left to fix. Her friend, Meg Collins, showed up partway through that. Photographer, camera bag over one shoulder, loud in a way that made the whole house feel more lived in. Meg said hi to me like she already knew who I was, which at the time I thought was just Meg being friendly. I went out to the van for a rag. When I came back in through the side door, I heard them in the corner of the kitchen, and Meg was not whispering as well as she thought she was. Meg said, Kate, tell him he is not going to guess. Kate said, not yet. Meg said something else I didn't catch, and then I made noise coming through the door, and they both turned around and started talking about a wedding shoot in Bluffton. I drove off 10 minutes later. And at the stop sign at the end of the block, I looked in my mirror, the way you do, and I could see straight through Kate's kitchen window from that angle. She was standing at the counter holding the blue mug in both hands, and she was looking at the door I had just closed. I told myself she was probably just tired. 6 weeks before the morning that started all this, she said the shower door was sticking. That one was true. I opened and closed it maybe 15 times, and you could feel the bottom hinge dragging, and when I got a light on it, the bushing was gone to powder. That's a part you order. The door was a discontinued frameless unit, and the hinge kit was back-ordered out of a warehouse in Ohio. 6 weeks. And in those 6 weeks, without either of us deciding it, a thing started happening on Saturday mornings. She'd come out her front door with the blue mug already full, and sit down in the second chair on my porch, the one nobody had ever used, and hand it to me. Not a mug for her and a mug for me. One mug, hers, made by her hands, handed across. We didn't talk much out there. Some Saturdays we said maybe 40 words between us. The Oaks would do that thing they do around 8 in the morning where the light comes through sideways and the moss lights up gray-green, and a car would go by, and the neighbor across the street would run his edger, and that was the whole event. 6 Saturdays. By the third one, I had started planning my Friday nights around being awake and presentable by 7:45. By the fifth one, I had started buying the coffee she liked, which was a small bag from a roaster on Habersham, and leaving it out on my counter where she'd see it if she came inside. I want to be clear that I never once said any of this out loud, not to her, not to Meg, not to myself in the truck. I just started waiting for Saturday. I didn't give the feeling a name. Naming it would have meant admitting I had one. 1 week after the morning in the bathroom, I came out my front door at 7:15 with a pipe wrench in one hand and a coil of PEX over my shoulder, and Jess Harmon was standing on the sidewalk in front of my house. I hadn't seen her in a year and a half. Not once. Savannah is not that big, and somehow we had managed it anyway, which tells you something about how hard two people can work at not running into each other. She looked good. She always looked good. That was never the problem. She said, "Hey, Rye." Nobody had called me Rye in 2 years. "I put the PEX in the van," I said, "Jess." She told me she'd moved back, that she was staying with her sister out in Georgetown while she got herself sorted. That Brad had turned out to be exactly what everybody said he was, which was news to me, because I hadn't said anything about Brad to anybody. There'd apparently been a girl in Atlanta for a while. Then she said she'd been doing a lot of thinking. I want to describe what that felt like, because it wasn't what I expected. I expected rage, or at least something warm. What I actually felt was the way you feel when you find a tool you lost 2 years ago and realize you already bought a new one and the new one's better. She said, "I think I owe you a real conversation." I said, "I'm doing all right, Jess. I hope everything works out for you." and then I shut the van door and I drove to a rough-in job on 52nd Street, and I didn't think about her again until Thursday. Thursday, she was at the coffee place on Habersham, where I sit for 20 minutes most mornings before my first call, sitting at the table next to the one I always take. She said it was a coincidence. The following Tuesday, she was in the parking lot of the supply house on Bull Street when I came out with a box of fittings. She said she'd been at the paint store next door. Then the phone calls started. 2 the first week, 4 the second. Nothing hostile. She'd ask how the business was going. She'd bring up something from when we were married, some good day, some trip out to Tybee, and she'd hold it out like a receipt she expected me to honor. On the third call, she said, "You seem different." I said I didn't think so. She said, "No, you are. You're lighter or something." Did something happen? I said no. That was a lie, and it was the first lie I'd told anybody in about a year, and I told it because I didn't want her to have it. Whatever it was, I didn't have a name for it yet, and I still knew I didn't want her holding it. And every call, right underneath the sweetness, there was something sharpening. She'd ask a question and then wait a half-second too long for the answer. The way you do when you're not curious, you're measuring. I stopped answering. She kept calling. What I did not know, because I was under sinks all day, was that she had started driving through Ardsley Park. She told me this later herself, and not the way you confess something, the way you present evidence. First time, she said, she saw my van parked in front of Kate's place at 4 in the afternoon on a weekday. Second time, 2 days later, same spot, same van. Third time she pulled to the curb halfway down the block and sat there with the engine off and watched me come out Kate's front door, and watched Kate follow me out onto the porch and hand me the blue mug, and watched me stand there drinking it. I don't know how long she sat there. She never said. Then she did the thing that anybody can do to anybody in the year we live in. She typed a name into a phone. Kate Sullivan. Savannah. Interior design. And what came back was a portfolio. Kate Sullivan Interior Design. A real website with a real domain. Dozens of projects, photographed properly. Whole house renovations in Ardsley Park and Habersham Woods, a restaurant build-out on Broughton Street, a showroom for a flooring company out on the south side, an about page with a photograph of Kate on a job site in a hard hat with a set of rolled drawings under her arm and 2 men in work boots standing next to her, listening to her, and a page called Partners. With a list, an electrician, a tile setter, a general contractor, a cabinet shop in Rincon, a licensed and bonded plumbing outfit with 4 trucks. Jess came to my house on a Friday night. She didn't knock. She'd texted first, and I made the mistake of texting back the word fine. She sat down at my kitchen table and put her phone on the wood between us, face up, and slid it across. She said, "Ryan, look at this." I looked at it. She said, "She's a professional interior designer. That is her actual job. She runs job sites. She has 3 contractors saved in her phone right now, and one of them is a plumber with 4 trucks. And she's been calling you over to look at a drain?" I didn't answer. She scrolled. She got to the hard hat photograph and left it there, big on the screen, Kate with drawings under her arm and her hand up mid-sentence, running a site. Jess said, "Does that look like a woman who can't figure out a water heater?" I said nothing. She said, "I called them, by the way. That plumbing company on her partner's page." I asked whether they'd worked with Kate Sullivan. The woman who answered said, "Oh, Kate, sure. We've been on 4 of her jobs this year." I said, "You called them." She said, "I wanted to be certain before I said anything to you. You should be glad somebody bothered. That is the whole shape of Jess Harmon in one exchange. And I want you to notice it, because I did not notice it at the time." She had gone digging. She had worked a stranger on the phone for information about a woman she had never met, and she was setting it in front of me as evidence that she cared about me. She said, "She's playing you. She's breaking things, or saying they're broken, so you'll come running. That's not cute. That's manipulation. I know you don't want to hear it from me, of all people, but somebody has to say it out loud, and apparently I'm the only one in this town who will." Then she stood up, picked up her phone, told me she'd be around, and left. I heard her car go down the block and take the turn a little too fast, the way she always did. I sat in my kitchen with the overhead light off, because I hadn't turned it on when she came in and neither of us had thought to. I looked down at my hands. There was still a black ring of pipe dope and grease around my right thumbnail from a job that morning, a repipe under a house on 49th where the crawl space was 14 inches high, and I'd spent 2 hours on my back in the dirt. I remember looking at that grease and thinking, very clearly, that Kate had seen my hands look like this probably 40 times and had never once said anything about it. And then I started going back through it. That's the part I'd tell you about, if I could only tell you one part, not the anger, because there wasn't much. I lay in bed that night and I ran the whole 14 months like a punch list. The knocking in the pipes in November. I ran every fixture in that house. I filled the tub. I ran the washer. There was no knock. There was never a knock. I went up into a crawl space and tightened 2 straps that were already tight, and I came down and drank coffee that had been poured before I got there. The water heater in December, thermostat at 120, factory setting, no fault, no fix, 1 hour and 10 minutes of conversation. The slow drain in the guest bath, 7 months ago. 6 feet of snake for a thumbnail of hair. A drain that would have cleared itself. The water pressure, 3 months ago. 60 pounds on the gauge. 60 is textbook. 60 is what you'd write down if you were making up a number that meant nothing is wrong. And the business cards. Under the peach magnet, Dale the electrician, a tile guy on Wilmington Island. A general contractor with a logo somebody paid for. I had stood in front of that refrigerator, I would guess, 25 separate times. I had leaned on the counter next to it eating dinner. I had set my flashlight down beside it. Those 3 cards had been at my eye level for 14 months, and I had looked straight through them the way you look through a window you clean every week. And the drawings on the dining table. Rolled sets, weighted with river rocks, dimensioned to the 1/8 of an inch. Nobody dimensions a hobby. The truth had been sitting out in the open in that house the entire time, in plain sight, not hidden even slightly. It had just never occurred to me to ask what it meant, because asking would have required me to first believe that a woman like that had any reason at all to want me in her kitchen. That's the part that got me. Not that I'd missed it. That I'd had every piece of it and still hadn't been able to arrive at the answer, because the answer required a premise I did not hold about myself. The shower handle had been real. The set screw was stripped. I held the part in my hand. I drove to Bull Street for it. The shower door hinge had been real. The bushing was powder. The kitchen faucet the first month had been real. 3 real things in 14 months. Everything else had been a reason. Here's what I keep trying to explain to people when I tell this, and I don't always get it right. I was not angry at Kate. I have gone back and checked, and it wasn't there. I've been angry before and I know the shape of it. What I felt was closer to vertigo. 14 months of my life had one meaning at 9 o'clock that night and a completely different meaning at 11, and I hadn't moved, and nothing had actually happened. Somebody had just handed me a different set of drawings for a building I was already standing inside, and underneath that, way underneath, there was something worse, and it took me 2 days to be able to say it to myself. I was afraid it was true in the small way instead of the large way, because there are 2 versions. In one version, a woman needed something and used me for it, the way you use a tool you don't have to pay for. And the coffee was just what you give the tool so it comes back. In the other version, a woman who could have called 4 trucks called me instead, over and over, for 14 months, and made up quieter and quieter reasons to do it. Jess had handed me the first version, wrapped and labeled, because the first version was the one that got her what she wanted. I lay there in the dark with my hands still smelling like pipe dope, and I thought about the coffee already being poured before I ever knocked. Every time. 14 months of it. That detail did not fit the first version at all. You don't pre-pour coffee for a tool. I did not sleep much. Around 1 in the morning, I got up and stood in my own dark kitchen for a while, and I noticed the bag of coffee from the roaster on Habersham sitting out on my counter, where I had been leaving it on purpose for 6 weeks so that a woman might see it. I had been running my own quiet campaign the whole time, smaller than hers and more cowardly, but the same species of thing, and that was the first crack in Jess's version, because if I had spent 6 weeks arranging a bag of coffee on a counter and calling it nothing, then I was not exactly in a position to be shocked that somebody else had spent 14 months arranging reasons. At about 2 in the morning, I said the sentence out loud, to my ceiling, in an empty house. If nothing was ever broken, then what was she asking for? I waited 2 days. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't strategy. I didn't have a plan. I waited 2 days because I have never in my life been good at saying a thing before I've turned it over enough times to know what it weighs, and because I was afraid that if I went over there angry, I'd say the version of it that Jess had handed me, in Jess's words, in Jess's tone, and I'd never be able to take that back. So Sunday evening, I walked next door, and for the first time in 14 months, I went over there with nothing in my hands. No bucket, no wrench roll, no flashlight on my belt. Just me, in a clean shirt, standing on a porch I'd been on 100 times. Kate opened the door, and she looked at my hands. I watched her do it. Her eyes went down and came back up, and something in her face changed and then went very still, and she held on to the edge of the door about a half-second longer than a person normally would before she stepped back and let me in. She already knew. Before I said one word, the coffee was on the counter in the blue mug. Of course it was. It was always there. I don't know when she'd poured it or whether she'd poured it the second she heard my screen door, and I have never asked. I didn't pick it up. I said, "Kate." She said, "Okay." I said, "That drain in the guest bath never really backed up, did it?" She put both hands flat on the counter, the way you brace when you're going to stand still for something instead of moving out of the way of it. She looked at the mug, not at me, and then she told me. She didn't cry and she didn't argue and she didn't lead with an excuse, and I've thought about that a lot since, because most people would have. She just laid it out in order, slowly, in a voice about 2 notches lower than the one she normally used. She said the first one was real. The kitchen faucet, the month after she moved in. That one was an actual leak, and she actually didn't know what to do about it, and she actually saw the logo on the van. She said the second one was not. She said in November she went upstairs one night and hit the pipe under the guest bathroom sink twice with the handle of a screwdriver to hear what it would sound like, and then she came down and made coffee and went out to the porch and waited for me to come home from work. She said, "I knew you'd find nothing. I was counting on you finding nothing. If you'd found something, you would have fixed it and left." She said after that it got easier and worse at the same time. Every reason had to be a little smaller than the last one because the big ones ran out. A noise, then a temperature, then a drain, then water pressure, which is the last thing left when you've used up everything that can actually break. She said, "I know how to fix most of that. I've supervised 4 bathroom gut jobs in the last 2 years. I know what 60 pounds means. I put a plumbing crew on a restaurant on Broughton Street." She said, "I have 3 contractors in my phone, and one of them owns 4 trucks." She said, "I didn't want them." And then she stopped for a second, and she said the thing. She said, "I wanted a reason for you to be in my house." I asked her why she never just said so, and she took a long time with that one. Long enough that I heard the refrigerator kick on. She said, "Because you'd have been kind about it." She said, "That's the part nobody understands. If I'd knocked on your door 14 months ago and told you I liked you, you would have been decent to me. You'd have said something gentle. And then there'd be a wall between our two front doors for as long as one of us lived here, and I'd have to see you get your mail every day for 6 years. She said, I'd rather have a fake broken drain and 45 minutes of you at my kitchen counter than a real answer and nothing. And she said, I know exactly how that sounds. I've known the whole time. There's a reason I never said any of it out loud until you asked me. I stood there in that kitchen and something opened up in the back of my head, and it was that sentence from 5 months earlier, the one I'd carried around doing nothing. Sometimes the reason somebody knocks isn't the reason they give, she'd told me. She had told me straight out, at her own dinner table, with the plates still on it, and I had said, huh, and carried the dishes to the sink. She said, I know Jess came to see you. Meg told me. Meg saw her car out front twice and got the plate and looked it up, because Meg is Meg. I said, she wasn't lying. Kate said, no. She wasn't. Every fact she gave you is true. I want to be very clear that I'm not going to stand here and tell you she made anything up. Then she said, but the truth doesn't always mean what somebody else decides it means. And I said, then tell me what it means. She said, it means I'm 28 years old and I have run job sites with 15 men on them, and I could not figure out how to knock on your door and say I like you. So I took my own house apart into pieces small enough to hand you one at a time. I looked at the mug, and I said, the only thing that was actually in my head, which was not a question about honesty or manipulation or any of the words Jess had used. I said, you knew how I take my coffee. The first time. The night the faucet was leaking. You had it poured before I got there, and it was right. Kate said, I asked you. The morning I moved in, on the steps, while you were carrying boxes, you told me 1 sugar. I said I didn't remember that. She said, I know you don't, you've never remembered it. And she said, I did. I want to tell you that I crossed the kitchen and that was that. I didn't. I stood there for maybe another 20 seconds and then I said I needed to think, and I said it in a flat voice, and I walked out her front door and back into my own house and shut it behind me. She didn't stop me. She didn't say wait. She didn't follow me out onto the porch. She didn't call, and she didn't text, and the next morning her car left at 7 and came back at 6, and that was the sum of what I knew about her all day. I've asked her about that since, and she said it was the easiest and worst decision she ever made in her life. She said she'd spent 14 months manufacturing reasons for me to come to her, and she had just found out how that looked from the outside, and she was not going to manufacture one more. That night, I sat out on my porch in the dark for a long time. Her kitchen light stayed on past midnight. I could see it as a yellow shape on the grass between our two houses. Once in a while, I'd see the light change, and I knew she'd walked in front of the window. And I sat there, and I finally found the actual thing that was wrong with me, and it was not what I expected. It wasn't that she'd hidden it. It was that Jess Harmon, the woman who had looked at my whole life and decided it was a settlement rather than a choice, the woman who had packed her things and gone, Jess was the one who had to come back to this town and sit at my kitchen table and tell me that somebody had been trying to stay. That's what got me. That's the whole thing. Somebody had spent 14 months quietly building reasons to be near me, and it took the person who left to explain it to me, because I did not have the equipment to see it on my own. I sat with that for about 3 hours, and somewhere in there it stopped being a wound and turned into something more like a fact about the shape of my own thinking. A stripped screw. Something to work around. I also did some arithmetic that I did not enjoy. Jess had left me because she believed I did not want anything, and she was closer to right than she knew. It wasn't that I lacked ambition. It's that, at some point I had quietly decided that wanting things out loud was for other people, and I'd built a whole life that never required me to do it. 1 van, 1 guy, no employees to disappoint, no partner to fail, a porch with a second chair that nobody had ever sat in until Kate sat in it. You can call that peaceful. I did, for 2 years. But a man who never asks for anything also never finds out whether the answer would have been yes. Kate had spent 14 months asking, in the only language she could get herself to speak, and I had spent 14 months being asked, and answering yes every single time, and never once noticing that the question underneath was never about the plumbing. Around 2, I went inside and slept. The next morning was Saturday. I got up at 7:45, the way I had every Saturday for 6 weeks, and I made myself presentable, which is a thing I had also been doing for 6 weeks and calling a coincidence. I got my coffee. I went out and sat down in the first chair on my porch, and the second chair was empty. No footsteps on the walk, no screen door, no blue mug. For the first time in 6 Saturdays, she didn't come. I sat there and looked at that empty chair for 5 minutes. I know it was 5 minutes because I looked at my phone when I sat down and I looked at it again when I stood up. And I want to tell you what those 5 minutes were, because they were the most useful 5 minutes of my adult life. The whole time we'd been doing this, I had been on the receiving end of it. Every single time. She knocked, I came. She poured, I drank. She invented a reason, I honored it. 14 months of a woman doing all of the work of getting us into the same room, and me being pleasantly surprised about it, over and over, like weather. And now she had stopped. Because she'd been told, essentially, that doing it made her a manipulator. So, she'd stopped. And if I sat in that chair, the whole thing was just going to end. Quietly, politely, 2 neighbors who used to have coffee. That was the moment I understood that being the man who never asks for anything is not the same as being a good man. Sometimes it's just being a man who has arranged his life so he can't be turned down. I put my mug on the rail. I walked down my steps and up hers and I knocked on her door. It took her a while. When she opened it, she had the blue mug in her hand, full, and I understood immediately that she had made it and then not brought it over, and had been standing in her own kitchen holding it. She looked at my hands again. They were empty again. Same as Sunday, and I watched her brace for it, the same way she'd braced at the counter, both feet planted, waiting for the sentence she'd already written for me in her head over the last 36 hours. And I said, "I didn't bring my tools." She didn't say anything, I said, "and I don't need a reason." Nothing dramatic happened after that. I think that's worth saying, because if you've been waiting for the big scene, this isn't the story that has one. What happened was that things got slightly easier by very small amounts over a long period of time. We didn't announce anything. There was no first date in the sense of a restaurant with a reservation and both of us being nervous in a parking lot. We just stopped pretending the plumbing had anything to do with it. The first real change was the door. Our 2 townhouses shared a wall, and at the back of both units there was a side door onto the same little strip of yard between the fence and the porches. Both of those doors had always been locked. About 5 weeks in, I came home from a repipe out in Georgetown and found mine unlocked, and Kate was at my kitchen table with her laptop open and a set of drawings weighted down with a coffee can full of drill bits. She said, "The light's better over here in the afternoon." That was the entire conversation about it. Neither of those doors was ever locked again. Other things went like that too. She started leaving a phone charger plugged in beside my couch. I started keeping the oat milk she likes in my refrigerator, which for a man who drinks his coffee black is a fairly public admission. One night in October, she fell asleep on my couch at 9:30 with a plan set across her knees, and I put a blanket over her and went to bed. And in the morning neither of us mentioned it, and after that, she stopped going home at the end of the evening quite so reliably. I want to be clear that we did talk about the 14 months. More than once. It wasn't a thing we skipped past because it was uncomfortable. She apologized properly, once, sitting on the tailgate of my van. Not for wanting it, for the method. She said she'd been dishonest with a man who had never been anything but straight with her, and that if it had gone the other way, if I'd been inventing reasons to get inside her house, she'd have been frightened by it, and she wasn't going to pretend the 2 situations were identical, But she also wasn't going to pretend she couldn't see the resemblance. I told her the truth, which was that I'd spent 2 days trying to be angry about it and had never gotten it to start. She said, "That's not the same as forgiving me." I said, "No, but I'm not sure what I'd be forgiving. You made me coffee for 14 months, and I let you." The Saturday thing came back. But it came back different, and this is the part I still think about. There were 2 mugs now, same blue glaze, but the new one sat level. The walls were even. The handle came off the body in one clean curve instead of the slightly apologetic angle the old one had. She'd fired it on a Tuesday night and set it on my counter without saying anything about it, and it took me until the next morning to understand what I was holding. The first mug was made by a woman who couldn't center anything, on a wheel with a bad bearing, back when she didn't know what she was doing yet. The second one was made by somebody who knew exactly what she wanted and had gotten good enough to make it. She never said that. She's not a person who explains her own symbolism, but she also didn't throw the first one away, and she made the second one, and she put it in my house. The work changed too, which sounds like a small thing and wasn't. Kate had been talking for a year about converting the back room of her place into a real pottery studio, not a corner with a wheel in it. A proper studio, with a slab table and a sink deep enough to wash out buckets and a clay trap so she wasn't putting slurry into a 1926 sewer line. So that fall, I ran the plumbing for it. And that job took 11 days, and every single hour of it was real. I cut into the wall, ran new supply, set a utility sink, built the clay trap, tied the drain into the stack. She pulled the permit through her own business because she knows how to pull a permit, and she inspected my rough-in herself before the county came because she knows how to read a rough-in. At one point, she looked at my work and said the slope on my drain line was generous and asked why. I said because a clay trap fills with grit and a lazy line will silt up in 2 years. She said, "Good," and wrote something on her plan set. That's the part that mattered. 14 months of invented reasons, and then 11 days of the two of us actually building something, where she knew more than I did, about half of it, and I knew more than she did about the other half, and nobody had to pretend anything was broken. 3 months after that, Ardsley Park had its block party. They do it every fall. They close off 2 blocks. Somebody brings a smoker. There's a folding table of casseroles and a folding table of drinks and about 150 people on the street until 9 at night. Jess came. I found out later she came with a woman 2 streets over that she'd stayed friendly with from when we were married. She was inside the neighborhood's guest list in a way I could not have prevented and would not have tried to. She waited. I'll give her that. She waited until there was a real crowd around the drinks table, maybe 20 people within earshot, and she waited until Kate was standing with 2 neighbors she'd only just met that summer. And then Jess said, at exactly the volume required, "Oh, Kate, right? Has Ryan told everybody the story about how you kept faking broken pipes so he'd have to come over? It's honestly kind of adorable." The conversation around us went flat. You could feel it. Kate did not say one word. She didn't defend herself. She didn't laugh it off. She set her cup down on the edge of the table, and she straightened up, and she stood there and took it, and her face gave away nothing at all. And I understood something in about a second and a half. She wasn't going to answer, because answering meant arguing about whether the facts were true, and the facts were true, and she had already decided a long time ago that she was going to carry that. So I put my hand on her shoulder and I turned around. I didn't raise my voice. I want that on the record, because I've replayed it enough times to be sure of it. I said it at a normal volume in a quiet street, and that made it worse for her than yelling would have. I said, "Jess, you left because you decided I wasn't enough." I said, "Kate spent 14 months making up excuses to be in a room with me. Then she ran out of excuses, and she's still here." And I said, "The difference between the two of you isn't who's right about the drain. The difference is who stayed." Nobody said anything for a couple of seconds. Somebody's kid went by on a scooter. Jess looked at me, and then she looked at the 20 people who had heard all of it, and she made a small sound like she was about to start on something else, and then she didn't. She left. I heard her car take the corner at the end of the block a little too fast, the way she always did. I didn't watch her go. I turned around, and Kate was looking at me, and I looked at Kate. And that was the whole rest of the conversation. Somebody behind us picked their casserole conversation back up mid-sentence, the way neighbors do when they've decided on your behalf that a thing is over. 10 minutes later, a man I'd known for 2 years asked me about his water heater. That's Ardsley Park for you. Kate didn't bring it up that night. She brought it up 4 days later, in the van, at a red light, and all she said was, "You didn't have to do that." I said, "I know I didn't," and she said, "That is exactly why it counted." 6 months in, the new blue mug lived in the cabinet over my coffee maker. Second shelf, front row, next to nothing in particular. Her toothbrush was in the cup in my bathroom, standing next to mine. Her shoes were by my front door, the pair with the paint on them. There was never a day when Kate moved in. Nobody carried a box. Nobody had a conversation about it. It happened the way coffee gets into a mug you left on the counter overnight, which is to say by soaking into everything slowly until you can't get it back out. She kept her townhouse, still has it. It's her studio now. The front room is her design office, with a proper drafting table and a plan rack and a wall of samples, and the back is the pottery studio with the utility sink I set. So she has a whole building for her work, and I have a whole house for the both of us, and the door between them stays open, and that arrangement has never once needed to be explained to anybody who's been inside it for more than 10 minutes. 9 months in, Meg came for a weekend. She dropped her bag in the hall and walked into my kitchen and stopped. There were 2 blue mugs on the counter, the old crooked one and the new even one. Both of them used that morning, both of them sitting there waiting to be washed. Meg looked at the mugs. Then she looked at Kate. Then she looked at me, and she said, "Finally." And Kate said, "It's been a while, Meg." Meg said, "I'm aware. I was there for most of it." I laughed at that, because it was funnier than Kate meant it, and because she was right in a way she wasn't trying to be. It had been a while, 14 months of a while, and then 2 more days on top of that because I needed to think. Here's what I figured out somewhere in that first year, and I'll put it as plainly as I know how. Kate is not the woman who came after Jess. That's the story people expect, and it isn't the shape of it. Kate is a completely different category of person, and comparing them is like comparing a leak to a foundation. Jess wanted me to become the man she needed. Every conversation in our marriage, underneath whatever it was about, was a version of that. Be more, charge more, want more. Be somebody who can walk into her firm's Christmas party and be interesting for 45 minutes. Kate never asked me to become anything. She just kept manufacturing reasons to be near the man I already was. A knock in a pipe that wasn't knocking. A water heater that was working fine. 60 pounds of water pressure. 6 Saturdays. One of those women needed me to change before I'd be worth having. The other one broke her own house down into small pieces, one at a time, for over a year, rather than risk hearing me say no. I know which one I'd have called ambitious. 1 year on from that Saturday, I was standing in my kitchen with a level in one hand, hanging a shelf. It's not my kitchen anymore, technically. It's the kitchen. Same house, same brick front, same live oaks over the street. But somewhere in the last 12 months, the pronouns changed on me without anybody filing paperwork. The shelf was going up over the coffee maker because we'd run out of room in the cabinet, because there are more mugs in this house now than 2 people can reasonably account for. Kate makes them faster than we break them. And on the top shelf, up where you have to reach, is the first blue mug. The crooked one. Uneven glaze, thick on one side where it ran before it set, and a bottom that doesn't quite sit flat on a countertop. We don't drink out of it anymore. It's been up there for months. It'll be up there for the rest of my life. I had the wrench in my hand and 2 anchors in my teeth when I heard footsteps on the tile behind me. I'd like to tell you I've gotten used to that sound." Kate came into the kitchen with the other blue mug in her hand, the even one, the one she made after she knew full, still steaming, one sugar, and she said, "Don't mind me." Same 4 words. Same easy voice. Same woman leaning in the same doorway with one hand on the frame. The first time she said it, I couldn't move a bolt another half turn. This time I laughed out loud, and I set the wrench down on the counter, and I reached over and pulled her in. That's the whole story. That's all of it. 1 year, 1 wall, 2 mugs. I spent 2 years believing I'd been left behind because I wasn't enough. 2 years of quietly organizing a life around never having to test that. 1 van, 1 guy, a porch chair nobody sat in, and the entire time, 30 feet away through a shared wall, there was a woman running out of ways to be near me. Not because I'd become somebody else, not because I'd finally gotten ambitious, or charged more, or gotten interesting at a Christmas party. Because I was exactly who I already was, standing under her sink with a shop towel, and that turned out to be the thing she wanted in the room. Here's what I know now that I didn't know then. Sometimes love doesn't knock on your door with a speech. It doesn't announce itself, and it doesn't make it easy on you. Sometimes it knocks with a leaky faucet, a noise in the pipes that isn't there, a cup of coffee that was poured before you ever arrived, made exactly the way you take it, by somebody who asked once and never forgot. And 4 words in a doorway, "Don't mind me." If you're a person who's been told once that you're not enough, I want you to hear this part especially, because it took me 2 years and 14 months of evidence to get it through my head. You will not be able to see somebody choosing you. Not at first. All the proof can be sitting right there on the refrigerator door under a peach magnet, and you will look straight through it every single time, because seeing it requires you to first believe you're worth crossing a room for. That's not a flaw in the other person. That's the thing you have to fix. And you can fix it. That's the good news. I'm not a man who changed. I'm a man who got up out of a porch chair one Saturday morning and walked 30 feet and knocked on a door with nothing in his hands. That was the whole repair. It took about 90 seconds. The crooked mug is on the top shelf. The good one is in her hand. Same blue, same glaze, same pair of hands that made both of them. One of them was made by a woman who didn't know yet. One of them was made by a woman who did. Same house, same porch, same 2 chairs, everything else is different. So, let me ask you 2 things before I go. Has somebody ever made up a small excuse just to be near you, a question they didn't need answered, a favor they could have handled themselves and you never once realized what it was? And if you figured it out today, right now, this afternoon, would you go knock on that door? If this story made you think of somebody, do me a favor, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me about them down in the comments. I read every single one of them. I set the wrench down. And this time, I didn't turn back to the hinge.